Victor Romang grabbed his daughter's wrist before she could pull away hard enough to bruise, hard enough to make her breath catch, and slammed her hand flat against the marriage contract. "You will sign this," he said, "or I will make sure you have nothing left worth protecting." He didn't raise his voice. Men like Victor never needed to. He pressed down until her fingers curled around the pen, until her hand was shaking and her jaw was locked tight against everything she refused to let him see. She signed. And the moment the ink dried, Victor Romang turned his back on his daughter like she was already gone. If you've ever felt like someone else was writing the story of your life, this one's for you. Subscribe to our channel, hit that notification bell, and follow Tia's story all the way to the end. Drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now let's begin. The nightclub was called Ember, and on any given Friday, it was loud enough that you couldn't hear yourself think, which was exactly why Tia Romang had chosen it. She didn't want to think. She had approximately 14 hours before her life ended, give or take, and she intended to spend as many of them as possible in a place where the bass hit so hard it rattled the bones and no one knew her father's name. She'd slipped past the two men Victor had stationed outside the family estate by telling them she was going to bed early and then climbing out the window of her second-floor bathroom like she was 17 again instead of 26. She'd done it before. She'd get better at it, she told herself. And then she remembered that after tomorrow there would be no more windows to climb through. Marco DeLuca's house would have security that answered to him, not to her, and the window would stay shut. She ordered a vodka soda at the bar and drank it in 4 long swallows and ordered another. The man next to her glanced over. He was young, harmless looking, the kind of guy who worked in finance and thought that made him dangerous. "Rough night," he said. "Rough life," Tia said, and he laughed like she was joking. She wasn't joking. She moved through the crowd toward the center of the floor and let the music take her somewhere that wasn't the dining room where her father had pushed a contract across the table at her. She'd known this was coming. She'd known it the way you know a storm is coming when you can smell the rain before the clouds arrive. A slow, grinding certainty that had been building in her chest for 2 years, ever since her father's business had started bleeding money, and Marco DeLuca had shown up with a checkbook and a condition. The condition was her. It was always her. She was the thing Victor Romang had that Marco DeLuca wanted, and in her father's world, that made her a commodity, not a daughter. She drank the second vodka faster than the first. Across the room, she didn't see the man who was watching her. She wouldn't have known who he was if she had. She'd never met Zane Valente. She'd heard the name. Her father said it the way you say the name of a weather event, something impersonal, something you prepare for, but the face was a stranger's face to her. Dark hair, dark suit, the kind of stillness that doesn't come from peace but from discipline, from years of training yourself not to react. He was sitting in the elevated section near the back, and he'd been watching Tia Romang for 40 minutes. He'd known she'd come here tonight. He'd known because he'd paid someone inside the Romang household to tell him things. And what that someone had told him 3 days ago was that Victor was finalizing the DeLuca alliance, that the wedding was set for Saturday, and that the daughter had a habit of disappearing the night before anything she didn't want to face. He'd been ready. He'd been patient. Zane Valente was very good at patient, but he hadn't expected her to look like that. He pushed the thought aside. It was irrelevant. What was relevant was the plan, and the plan was simple. Take the girl, use her to get Victor Romang to the table and make Victor pay for what he'd taken from the Valente family 4 years ago. A warehouse. 3 men. One of them had been Zane's younger brother, and he'd been 22 years old and he'd never made it home. Victor had covered it up. Victor had connections in this city that went all the way to the mayor's office, and the investigation had died in 48 hours, and Zane had spent 4 years building toward this moment. He was not going to let a pretty girl in a black dress complicate it. He nodded at the man standing near the exit. The man nodded back. The music was peaking when Tia felt a hand close around her elbow. Not aggressive, not rough, just firm, purposeful, the grip of someone who'd made a decision. She spun around fast, already pulling away, already opening her mouth to say something that would have peeled the paint off the walls, and she found herself looking up at a man she'd never seen before. "I think you dropped this," he said, and he held out a small black card. Tia looked at it. It wasn't hers. She looked back at him. "That's not mine." "I know," he said, "but I needed a reason to talk to you." She almost laughed. Under different circumstances, she might have. He was good-looking enough that she could see why it usually worked: the jaw, the dark eyes, the suit that cost more than most people's rent. But she hadn't come here to be approached by someone using bad lines. "Not interested," she said, and turned back to the crowd. He didn't grab her again. He didn't follow. She felt him step back, and something about that registered faintly in the back of her mind, the way things register when they don't match the pattern. But the vodka was working by now, and the music was loud, and she let it go. It was 20 minutes later, when she went to the bar for her third drink, that the room started to tilt. Not badly, not like she'd been drugged, which is what she thought for one terrible second. But no, it was just the alcohol on an almost empty stomach, and 2 nights of bad sleep, in the stress that had been knotting itself tighter and tighter in her chest for the last 72 hours. She gripped the edge of the bar. The bartender looked at her. "You okay?" "Oh, fine," she said, which was what she always said. She wasn't fine. The room was warm and too loud, and she needed air, and she pushed toward the back exit, the one she'd clocked when she walked in, because she always clocked exits. A habit her father had drilled into her since she was a child, the one useful thing he'd ever given her. The door pushed open, and the night air hit her face, and she breathed it in and felt better marginally, and then she heard footsteps behind her and turned, and there he was again. The man with the card. "I said I wasn't interested," she said. "I heard you," he said. "I'm not here about that." Something in his voice was different now. The easy social layer was gone. This was the voice underneath it, the one that didn't perform. It made her go still in the way that animals go still when they sense something their conscious mind hasn't caught up to yet. "Then what are you here about?" she said. "Your father," said Zane Valente. "And what happens to you tomorrow?" The silence between them stretched. Tia's heart was beating faster, and she hated that she couldn't keep it level. "You don't know anything about tomorrow," she said. "I know about the contract," he said. "I know about DeLuca. I know that you walked out of the signing, and your father gave you until morning to come back and cooperate." He paused. "I know your father has 2 men circling this building who are going to come in approximately 10 minutes when you don't respond to the check-in text." Tia stared at him. The cold feeling in her chest was back. "Who are you?" "Someone who needs you," he said, "for reasons that have nothing to do with your father's reasons. And I'd like you to come with me voluntarily because the alternative is messier, and I'd rather not." "Come with you?" Her voice was flat. "You'd like me to just come with you? To where? To do what?" "I'll explain everything," he said, "but we have about 8 minutes now." "I'm not going anywhere with you." She took a step back toward the door. "I don't know who you are. I don't know what you want, and I'm not Zane Valente," he said quietly. Tia stopped moving. She knew that name. She knew what that name meant. She knew the history that lived inside it, the years of Cold War between their families, the things her father said about the Valentes that she'd always filed under things men say about enemies, which usually meant the enemy had done something they deserved credit for. Her father's enemies were, as a rule, people he'd wronged. "Valente," she repeated. "Yes. You want to use me against my father." He didn't deny it. "Yes." She almost respected that. She would have respected it more if she hadn't been the thing being used. "And if I don't go with you voluntarily, then I have 4 men who will handle the situation," he said, "and we'll have a much less pleasant conversation on the other end of it. I don't want that. I'm telling you the truth about who I am and what I want because I think you're smart enough to understand that your options tonight were limited, and this one is better than going back to your father. Those are my only options. You are my father. Tonight, Tia looked at him. The night air was cold and clear, and she was thinking faster than she had all evening. The alcohol burning off under the adrenaline because whatever else was happening. This was real, and it required her full attention. She thought about tomorrow. She thought about Marco DeLuca's name on a contract next to hers. She thought about the look on her father's face when she'd pushed back her chair. Not anger, not hurt, just impatience, like she was a clock that needed adjusting. "If I go with you," she said slowly, "what happens to me? You stay in a secure location. You're not harmed. You're not mistreated. I contact your father. I make my demands. And when it's resolved, you go free. And your demands are between me and your father. And if I cooperate, if I'm what a good hostage, you let me walk away at the end. That's the deal." She studied him. He was still doing that thing, that stillness, that total lack of performance. He wasn't trying to charm her anymore. He wasn't trying anything. He was just standing there in the truth of what he was and what he wanted. And somehow that was more alarming than anything else he could have done, because people who didn't bother to lie were people who didn't think they needed to. She heard her phone buzz in her pocket. Check-in text. One of her father's men, 6 minutes. If I scream, she said, right now, those men inside will hear me. They will, Zane agreed, and then they'll call your father, and your father will have you home and married by noon tomorrow. And you'll spend the rest of your life as Marco DeLuca's wife, and in about 3 years, Marco DeLuca will get himself killed in the kind of business dispute that men like him always get killed in, and you will be a widow at 29 in a house that isn't yours with people who answer to his family, not to you. He paused. Or you can come with me. Tia hated him a little in that moment. Not because he was wrong, because he was exactly right. In the infuriating way that people are right when they've studied a situation more carefully than you have, and they know it. I want it on record, she said, that I think you're a deeply arrogant man. Noted, he said, and that I'm not doing this because I'm scared. I'm doing this because my options are genuinely terrible. Also noted. And when this is over, she pointed at him a sharp, precise gesture. We are going to have a very different conversation about the way you handled tonight. Something moved through his expression, not quite a smile, something adjacent to it. I look forward to it, he said. Now, please. She walked past him toward the black car idling at the curb, and she didn't look back, and she told herself it was strategy. It was all strategy. She was in control of this situation in every way that mattered, and she was going to stay in control of it. And Zane Valente had made a significant error in judgment if he thought that taking Victor Romang's daughter meant taking someone who would sit quietly and wait to be rescued. She was not waiting to be rescued. She was waiting for an opening. The car moved through the city, and Tia sat in the back with Zane, and the silence between them was the kind that happens when two people are each pretending to be calmer than they are. She watched the streets. She was memorizing the route. Every turn, every landmark, every light, she was cataloging it, building a map in her head, because the first rule of any bad situation was to know exactly where you were. You're memorizing the route, Zane said. She didn't look at him. I'm looking out the window. You've noted 4 turns and 2 landmarks in the last 90 seconds. Tia turned her head and looked at him then. Were you always this annoying, or is this something you developed? My brother always said I was born this way, he said, and something crossed his face when he said it fast there and gone, but she caught it, the way a light flickers before it goes out. Something that lived in the past tense. She filed it. The house was not what she expected. She'd expected something fortified, something that announced its own menace. What she got was a tall brick building on a quiet street, the kind of building that looked like money but not like power, which meant someone had spent considerable effort making it look that way. Smart, she noted it. Inside, a man met them in the entry. Older gray at the temples, the kind of face that had seen enough that very little moved it anymore. He looked at Tia and then at Zane and said nothing. This is Rafe, Zane said. He runs the house. He'll show you to your room. My room, Tia said. You'll have your own space. Privacy, meals when you want them. I'm not running a prison. You kidnapped me from a nightclub. I gave you a choice. That's a fascinating interpretation of what happened. She looked at Rafe. Are you going to show me to my room or just stand there? Rafe almost smiled. Almost. He gestured toward the stairs and Tia followed him, and at the top of the first landing, she turned and looked back down, and Zane was still standing in the entry, watching her, and she held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds before she turned away. She needed to think. She needed to think clearly and carefully, and without the noise of the nightclub and the vodka, and the fear she was keeping very carefully locked in a box in the back of her chest, because fear was useful when it sharpened you, and destructive when it ran you. She had been trained in ways her father never intended to survive exactly this kind of situation. Not because Victor Romang had tried to prepare her, because she'd grown up watching powerful men operate and she had paid attention to every single thing they did, and she had filed it all away for the day she would need it. That day was apparently today. The room was clean, a wide bed, a window, she checked it immediately. 3rd floor, a drop, but survivable. A bathroom, a door that locked from inside, which she locked. She sat on the edge of the bed and breathed. Zane Valente. She turned the name over. She knew what her father had said about the Valentes. She knew the shape of the story her father told. But she'd learned a long time ago that there were always two stories. There was the story a powerful man told about his enemies, and there was the truth, and these two things were rarely the same. Her father had enemies because her father did things that made enemies. That was not a mystery. That was arithmetic. She thought about the flicker on Zane's face when he mentioned his brother. Past tense. Something that had happened and couldn't unhappen. She lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling. She was not a victim. She was an opportunity she had chosen to take because the alternative was worse. And she was going to be smart about this, and she was going to find out every single thing there was to know about Zane Valente and what he wanted from her father. And she was going to use that information before he could use her. That was the plan. She was good at plans. She just needed to be better at this one than he was. Downstairs, Zane stood in his office and stared at the phone in his hand and thought about the way she'd walked past him toward the car. Not hesitating, not trembling, just walking with her chin up and her spine straight and her eyes already somewhere ahead of the current moment, already calculating. He'd studied Victor Roman's daughter for 3 months before tonight. He knew her history, the degree she'd finished while her father tried to push her into appearances and marriages, the 2 times she'd refused alliances before this one, the quiet but persistent way she moved through her father's world without ever quite becoming part of it. He'd thought he understood what he was dealing with. He was beginning to think he'd underestimated her. He thought about the moment at the back of the club when she'd looked at him after he'd said the name Valente. She hadn't panicked. She hadn't run. She'd gone still and thought, and then she'd asked the exact right questions in the exact right order. Who are you? What do you want? What happens to me? What are your demands? All tactical, all precise, like someone who'd been trained to extract intelligence from hostile conversations, which he supposed in a way she'd been. You didn't grow up as Victor Roman's daughter without learning how to read a room. His phone buzzed. The contact was labeled simply VR Victor Roman, calling within 40 minutes of Tia's disappearance, faster than Zane had expected. He answered. Valente. Victor's voice was controlled, almost perfectly controlled. Zane had heard that voice in recordings, in intercepted calls, in stories from people who'd sat across from the man at a table and lost something they couldn't get back. It was the voice of a man who believed that composure was the highest form of power. Romain, Zane said, you want to tell me what you think you're doing? I'd have thought it was obvious. A beat. Where is she safe? I'm going to need a more specific answer than that. I'm sure you are, Zane said, but tonight that's the answer you get. I'll be in touch tomorrow with terms. In the meantime, your daughter is comfortable and unharmed, and she will stay that way as long as our conversation stays productive. If you touch her, I told you, she's unharmed. Valente? The composure cracked just a hair, just a thread. You have no idea what you've started. I have a very good idea, Zane said quietly. I've been thinking about it for 4 years. He ended the call. He set the phone down on the desk and put his hands flat against the surface and breathed slow and even. The way he'd taught himself to breathe when the anger tried to get ahead of the plan. 4 years. He'd been 28 when Matteo died. He was 32 now, and sometimes it felt like those 4 years were a single long exhale, a held breath he'd been waiting to release. He was close. He was so close. He just needed to stay sharp and stay cold and not let anything complicate what was already complicated enough. Upstairs, he heard movement. A door. Then nothing. He looked at the ceiling. He told himself it was irrelevant. He almost believed it. In the room on the 3rd floor, Tia Romain had found the small notepad on the nightstand and was writing down everything she knew about Zane Valente, and next to his name she wrote brother past tense. And below that she wrote, what did my father do? And below that in smaller letters, almost like she was trying to take up less space with the thought. And would I have done the same? She capped the pen. She folded the paper. She tucked it into her shoe, which was the only place in this room she could be reasonably certain wouldn't be searched. She turned off the light. Tomorrow the real game would begin. She was ready. She didn't sleep, not really. She drifted in and out of something that wasn't rest, something closer to a coiled alertness that kept snapping her back to the surface every time her body tried to go under. By the time the gray light started coming through the window, she'd given up on sleep entirely and was sitting on the floor with her back against the bed thinking. The thinking wasn't panic. She'd made a deliberate decision sometime around 3 in the morning to stop running the fear through her head and start running the facts. Facts were manageable. Facts had edges you could hold on to. The fear was just fog, and fog didn't help her. Fact 1. Zane Valente had taken her to use against her father, which meant her value to him was contingent on her father's response. As long as Victor engaged, she was an asset. The moment Victor stopped engaging, or the moment Zane got what he wanted, that calculation shifted, and she needed to understand what it shifted into. Fact 2. Zane had a brother. Past tense. And whatever had happened to that brother had something to do with Victor Romano, which meant this wasn't business. This was personal. Personal was both more dangerous and more predictable than business because it had a shape to it, a logic. People who wanted money were unpredictable because money was abstract. People who wanted justice or revenge, which was what justice looked like when it had been waiting too long. Those people had a specific destination in mind. She could work with a destination. Fact 3, he hadn't lied to her, not once. He told her his name. He told her his intentions. He'd given her an honest accounting of her options. That was either a sign that he was a man who operated on principle or a sign that he was so confident in his position that he didn't need to bother lying. She wasn't sure yet which one it was, and it mattered. She heard footsteps in the hall outside her door at 7:15. Measured, even not hurrying. The knock that followed was 2 clean raps, not aggressive, almost courteous. "Breakfast," a voice said. "Rafe." She unlocked the door. He was holding a tray. Coffee, toast, eggs. He set it on the small table near the window and stepped back. He moved like a man who had learned not to take up more space than necessary, which was a particular skill she associated with people who had spent significant time in proximity to dangerous men. "Rafe," she said. He looked at her. "How long have you worked for him?" "Long time," Rafe said. "Since before the brother." Something moved in his face. Careful. Controlled. "Eat your breakfast, Miss Romano." "That's a yes," she said. He left without answering. She poured the coffee and stood at the window with it and drank and watched the street below and thought about the way his face had changed when she mentioned the brother the same way Zane's had in the car. Whatever had happened to the Valente brother, it had left a mark on everyone around him. You could still feel it in the room 3 floors up on a morning that was cold and quiet and nothing like the life she was supposed to be walking into right now. She was supposed to be getting dressed for her wedding at this hour. She thought about that, really let herself think it, and felt something that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite guilt, but it lived somewhere between the two. The door opened without a knock this time. Zane walked in and stopped when she turned. His eyes moved to the untouched toast, then back to her face. He looked like he'd been up all night too, though on him, it didn't show the way it might on someone else. It just made him look like what he was, a man who'd been operating under pressure for so long that pressure had become his baseline. "Your father called 4 times this morning," he said. "I'm sure he did." "He wants to speak to you." "I'm sure he does." Zane studied her. "You're not worried?" "I'm absolutely worried," she said. "I'm just not going to let you watch me be worried. There's a difference." She set the coffee cup down. "What does my father want?" "Proof of life," his words. "And are you going to give it to him?" "That depends on you." She crossed her arms. "Meaning what exactly?" "Meaning I'd like you to speak to him. Briefly. Tell him you're unharmed. It keeps him engaged, and it keeps the conversation productive." He paused. "It also prevents him from doing something reckless out of uncertainty." Tia looked at him. "You want me to be the one to keep my father calm. You know him better than I do." "That's true," she said. "I also know that my father doesn't get reckless when he's uncertain. He gets very, very still. And when he gets still, it means he's already moved to a plan you haven't thought of yet. So if you're waiting for him to panic, you're going to be waiting a long time." She watched Zane's jaw tighten just slightly and push further. "What exactly are your demands, Valente? Because if I'm going to help you keep this productive, I need to know what productive looks like." "That's not your concern. You made me your concern when you put me in this room. My involvement in this situation didn't begin and end at the nightclub. If my father knows that he'll use it, he'll use anything." She took a step toward him. "What did he do to your brother?" The stillness that came over Zane's face then was different from his usual stillness. It was the kind that came before something moved at the held moment before the crash. She felt it in the air between them, and she didn't back up. "That," he said very quietly, "is not something we were going to discuss." Then you're going to be at a disadvantage, she said. Because I can't help you outmaneuver my father if I don't understand what he took from you, and you need me to help you, whether you've admitted that to yourself or not. He looked at her for a long moment, long enough that she could see him deciding something, weighing it, turning it over. Then he said, "Get dressed. We'll talk downstairs." She raised her eyebrows. "That's as close to a concession as you get, isn't it?" "Get dressed, Tia." It was the first time he'd used her name. She noticed it. She didn't let him see that she noticed it. She just turned back to the window and waited until she heard the door close behind him. Downstairs, the room he brought her into was not what she'd been calling an office in her head. It was more like a war room, though it didn't announce itself as one. A long table, papers, laptops, a board on the far wall with photographs and names connected by lines she couldn't quite read from where she stood. She tried, and he stepped in front of it. "Subtle," she said. "Sit down." She sat. He sat across from her. Rafe was in the corner, quiet as furniture. "Your father," Zane said, "has a man named Carver, former federal investigator. Your father put him on payroll 6 years ago. His job is to make problems disappear before they become problems." Tia knew the name. She'd heard it once in a conversation she wasn't supposed to hear through a door she hadn't been supposed to be standing behind. She kept her face neutral. "Go on." 4 years ago, there was a dispute over a warehouse on the east side of the city, distribution point. My family had held that contract for 11 years. Your father wanted it. Zane's voice was flat, factual, the flatness of something held down by force. He didn't negotiate. He sent men. 3 of my people were inside that night. He stopped. He breathed. Mateo was 22. He'd been working with me for 6 months. He thought it was going to be a routine check. Another pause. Carver made it look like a robbery. The investigation closed in 48 hours. Tia was quiet. "I want Carver," Zane said, "and I want your father in a room where he has to admit what he did, in front of people who matter. People who will make sure the kind of protection he's bought in this city dries up." He looked at her directly. "That's what I want. Not money, not the warehouse. Accountability." Tia thought about her father, about the man who had held her hand against a contract that morning, who had pressed down until she signed, who had turned his back on her like she was a closed transaction. She thought about all the rooms she'd been in where powerful men talked about things that disappeared people, and she'd been expected to sit decoratively and not absorb anything. She'd absorbed everything. "Carver," she said slowly, "keeps his own records." Zane went very still. "He keeps them because he's not stupid," she said. "Because a man in his position, working for a man like my father, understands that the day your employer decides you're a liability, the only thing that keeps you breathing is what you know and what you can prove." He's insulated himself. I overheard my father talking about it once, about how Carver was, she chose the word carefully, thorough. My father didn't mean it as a compliment. Where Zane said, and the word came out like something he'd had to work to keep measured. "I don't know where. I heard the conversation once 2 years ago. But I know it exists, and I know my father knows it exists, which means if Carver is brought into whatever you're planning, he'll produce it or he'll threaten to. And that documentation would be," she looked at Zane steadily, "exactly what you're looking for. If you could get to it first." Zane looked at her. She watched him recalibrate in real time, the way she'd watched her father recalibrate when information shifted his position. But it looked different on Zane. Her father recalibrated with his face closed entirely. Zane did it with something that was almost transparent, a rapid, visible reassessment, like he hadn't yet learned to perform his thinking rather than actually do it. She found it disarming and refused to be disarmed. "How?" he said. "I don't know yet, but I know my father's systems better than you do, and I know how he keeps information he doesn't want found, which means I might know how Carver mimicked it." She leaned forward slightly. "This is what I mean about needing me, not as a hostage, as someone who can actually help you get what you want." "Why would you help me?" he said. "He's your father. He held my hand against the table this morning and forced me to sign a contract that sold me to a man I've met once in my life." Her voice was level, steady. She kept it that way. "He stopped being my father a long time before that. He just let me see it this morning." The room was very quiet. Rafe in the corner made a small sound that wasn't quite anything, but she felt his attention shift. Zane didn't look away from her. You understand what you'd be agreeing to. I understand exactly what I'd be agreeing to, she said. The question is whether you trust me enough to let me be useful or whether you're going to keep me in that room upstairs and lose the best resource you have. The silence stretched. She let it stretch. She didn't fill it, didn't reassure, didn't soften it. She'd learned that from watching her father, that the person who fills the silence loses. I need to think about it, Zane said finally. That surprised her. She'd expected either yes or no. She'd expected certainty. The admission that he needed to think was, she realized, another piece of information. He was careful. He didn't commit to things he hadn't thought through. She updated her understanding of him again. Fair enough, she said. She was taken back upstairs by Rafe, who stopped at the door and said without looking at her, He doesn't trust easily. I know, she said. He trusted Matteo. A pause. He hasn't trusted anyone the same way since. She looked at Rafe. He was looking at the wall. Why are you telling me that? Because you asked the right questions this morning, he said. And I've been working for that man for 8 years, and I know the difference between someone who's going to make this better and someone who's going to make it worse. He turned then and met her eyes for just a moment. Don't make it worse. He left. She locked the door. She sat on the bed and put her hands in her lap and let herself feel the shape of the situation fully, because she needed to understand it not just tactically, but honestly. She was angry at her father. She had been angry at her father for years, a slow, steady anger she'd kept carefully controlled, because uncontrolled anger in her father's world was a weapon other people used against you. But she was also not naive enough to think that helping Zane Valente was a simple or straightforward thing. He was not a good man in the conventional sense. He had taken her from a nightclub. He had a plan that had been building for 4 years, and it had teeth in it, real teeth, and if it went wrong, it would go catastrophically wrong. And yet, she thought about Matteo, 22 years old, a routine check. She thought about her father saying something was handled in the quiet tone he used when handled meant disappeared. She'd never known who. She'd never known the names. Now she knew one. Her phone buzzed. She'd been surprised they'd left it to her, then understood. They'd want to monitor calls. Her father's number flashed. She stared at it. She answered. Tia. Victor's voice was controlled, but she knew him. Underneath the control was something she'd heard exactly twice before, once when a deal collapsed, that he'd been certain of once when her mother walked out and didn't come back. It wasn't fear. It was the particular fury of a man who has been denied something he considered his. I'm fine, Papa, she said. Calm, even. Where are you? I don't know, she said, which was true enough. Has he hurt you? No. Good. A beat. I need you to listen to me carefully. Whatever he's told you, whatever story he's giving you about why this is justified. He told me about Matteo Valente, she said. Silence. Complete, total silence. And in that silence, she heard her father's entire architecture of composure crack along a line she'd always known was there. Tia, his voice dropped. Did you know his name? She asked. The one who didn't make it out of the warehouse. Did you know he was 22? That, her father said, and his voice was cold now. Cold in the way that meant that she'd gone somewhere he hadn't expected her to go, is a conversation for when you're home. Right, she said. When I'm home, dressed for a wedding and signing more things you push at me. She kept her voice even. She felt her heart slamming, but she kept her voice even. I'll be in touch, Papa. She hung up. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat on her knees and breathed and let the shaking run its course, and then it stopped. She was her father's daughter. In at least one way, she knew how to come back to level. She just came back to a different level than he did. He came back to control. She came back to clarity. Downstairs, she was certain Zane had heard that call. She'd said what she said deliberately because she needed him to hear it. Needed him to understand that she wasn't playing both sides, wasn't feeding information back to her father. She just told Victor she knew, and knowing would make Victor move faster, and Zane needed to know that. The knock at her door came 6 minutes later. 2 raps. Zane. She opened it. He looked at her differently than he had that morning. She couldn't put a clean word to it. It wasn't softness, wasn't trust, exactly wasn't the reassessment from earlier. It was something that hadn't been there before and didn't have a name yet. You just told your father you know, he said. Yes. He'll move now. He'll try to shut down any possibility that the information gets out. Yes, she said again. Why? She looked at him steadily. Because you needed to know he'd move, and because you needed to know that I'm not going to be used by two people at once. You're the one I'm dealing with, not him. She paused. That's not loyalty to you, Valente. Don't mistake it for that. That's me deciding who the more rational person in this situation is. He was quiet for a moment. Then, Carver meets with your father every Tuesday. They do it at a private dining room at a restaurant called Sable on the north side. Your father thinks it's secure because he owns the building. She raised her eyebrows slightly. He doesn't own the building, Zane said. I do. I've owned it for 14 months. She stared at him, despite everything, despite the full and careful control she had over her reactions. Something that was almost a laugh moved through her chest. You planned this for 14 months. Longer, he said, but the building, yes. You have recordings. From the last 11 meetings, he said, enough to build a case, not enough to put in front of the right people because I don't have the documentation that ties Carver to the warehouse specifically. His own records. His eyes didn't leave hers. Which you told me exist. Which I told you exist, she confirmed. I need to find them. I know. And you think you can help me find them. I think, she said carefully, that I know the way my father secures things he's afraid of, and I think Carver, who learned everything he knows about information security from working for my father, probably does it the same way. She leaned against the door frame. I also think that Tuesday is 4 days away, and if my father thinks I know about the warehouse, he is going to move on Carver's records himself, to make sure they can never surface. Zane's jaw set. She watched him do the same math she'd already done, and arrive at the same place. We don't have 4 days, he said. No, she said. We probably have 2, maybe less. The look on his face then was something she hadn't seen on him yet. Not anger, not calculation. Something rawer than both of those. The look of a man who has been patient for 4 years and has just been told that patience might cost him everything. Then we start now, he said. She straightened. Then I need my laptop and full access to whatever you've compiled on my father's operations over the last 14 months. She met his eyes. And I need you to understand that when we find what we're looking for, I'm not a resource you discard at the end. I'm a partner, or I'm not involved. The word partner hung in the air between them. She watched him look at it, turn it over, examine what it cost him. Partners, he said finally, like the word was something he was testing the weight of, like he hadn't said it about anyone in a very long time. Partners, she confirmed. He stepped back from the doorway. She walked past him into the hall and didn't let herself think about the fact that 24 hours ago she'd been in a nightclub trying to drink her way through the last night of her freedom, and now she was here in a house owned by her family's oldest enemy, shaking hands on something that had no name yet and no guaranteed ending. She was not afraid. She was something she didn't have a clean word for, something charged and forward-leaning, something that felt against all logic, like being exactly where she was supposed to be. Which was, she told herself, just adrenaline. Just adrenaline. She almost believed it. They worked through the morning and into the afternoon without stopping. And somewhere in that stretch of hours, the dynamic between them shifted in a way that neither of them acknowledged directly, because acknowledging it would have required a conversation neither of them was ready to have. Tia had the laptop Zane's people brought on her, and she had the files 14 months of compiled intelligence on Victor Roman's operations, organized with a precision that told her something about the man who'd built it. Not chaotic, not emotional. Every document cross-referenced, every timeline accounted for every gap labeled as a gap rather than papered over with assumption. She'd expected the files of a man running on rage. What she found was the work of someone who had converted rage into something colder and more durable. She didn't tell him that. She just worked. Your father uses a tiered archive system, she said around 11 in the morning, not looking up from the screen. Physical and digital, always both. He doesn't trust either one alone. The physical copy is insurance against a hack. The digital is insurance against a fire. She pulled up a schematic she'd drawn from memory on a yellow legal pad. Carver would have learned that from him, which means Carver's records exist in 2 forms somewhere. Zane leaned over her shoulder to look at the schematic. He was close enough that she was aware of it and chose not to be. Where does your father keep his physical archive? His study at the estate, hidden behind the east wall panel, it looks like a built-in bookshelf, but the third shelf from the bottom swings out. She said it without hesitation, then stopped. She felt Zane go still beside her. She understood why. She'd just handed him the location of her father's most sensitive documents without a pause. "Don't read into that," she said. "I'm not going to feel guilty about telling you. He gave up the right to my loyalty this morning." "I'm not judging you," Zane said quietly. "Good." She turned back to the screen. "Carver won't keep his records at his own address. Too obvious. He'll have a secondary location, something that looks unrelated to him on paper. A storage unit at a rented office, a property under a different name." She chewed the end of the pen. "Does your compiled file include Carver's property holdings?" Zane moved to his own laptop and pulled up the file. 3 properties under his name. 1 house, 1 commercial unit. He listed as a consulting office. 1. He stopped. She looked up. "What?" "1 storage facility, registered 18 months ago. The LLC that owns it was incorporated in Delaware. The registered agent is a law firm that also appears in 2 of your father's shell company filings." Tia set the pen down. "That's it?" "We don't know that. It's registered 18 months ago, which is 4 months after my father started getting nervous about the Valente situation escalating. Don't look at me like that. I pay attention, and it's linked to a law firm that my father uses for things he wants to be difficult to trace. Carver was protecting himself in advance." "That's it." She met his eyes. "That's the location." Zane looked at her for a moment. "You're fast." "I've been reading my father's patterns my whole life," she said. "It's not skill, it's survival." He held her gaze just a beat longer than was strictly necessary, and then looked back at his screen, and Tia turned back to hers, and neither of them said anything for a while. Rafe brought food at noon that neither of them ate while it was hot. Tia picked up a piece of toast 40 minutes after it had gone cold and ate it standing up, still reading a document, and Zane drank his coffee without looking at it and kept working, and she thought distantly that this was the most productively she had spent a Tuesday in as long as she could remember, which was a thought so strange given the circumstances that it almost made her laugh out loud. It was at 12:47 that her phone rang, not her father's number, a number she didn't recognize. She looked at it, looked at Zane. "Answer it," he said. She did. "Hello? Miss Romang?" The voice was smooth, careful. The voice of a man who chose every word with his mouth before it got anywhere near his face. "My name is Carver. I think you know who I am." The cold that moved through her chest was different from the one she'd felt the night before. This was sharper, more specific. She kept her voice completely level. "I know who you are." Zane was already on his feet, moving toward her. She tilted the phone slightly so he could hear. He leaned in. Again close. Again she chose not to notice. "I think we should talk," Carver said. "Without your host present, ideally." "That's not going to happen," she said. "I thought you might say that." A pause. "I want you to understand something, Miss Romang. I have no problem with you personally. My business is with the situation, not the people in it. And the situation, as I see it, is that you've put yourself in a position that benefits no one. Not Valente, not your father, and certainly not you. And speaking to you privately would benefit me. How exactly?" "I have information," Carver said, "about your father that goes beyond the warehouse. Information that concerns you specifically. Your history, your lineage." A deliberate pause that he'd timed carefully, the pause of a man who knew how to use silence as leverage. "Information that would change the way you understand everything that's happened to you." Tia's jaw tightened. She held it. "That's a very broad claim." "I know. I'd make it anyway." Another pause. "Come meet me, alone. I'll give you 30 minutes and I'll give you the truth about who you actually are, and then you can go back to Valente and whatever you're building with him and make whatever choices you want. But you deserve to know this before it becomes a weapon someone else uses against you." The line went quiet. He'd hung up. Tia lowered the phone. The room felt different. Zane was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him yet. Not the calculation, not the raw anger from the night before, not the almost transparency when he was reassessing. This was something careful, something that was paying attention to her in a way that had nothing to do with tactics. "Don't," he said. "I'm not going to meet him alone if that's what you're worried about." "I'm not worried about that. I'm worried about what he said." His voice was measured, but underneath it, something moved. The part about your lineage. She looked at him. What do you know? Nothing certain. Zane. It was the first time she'd used his name. She saw it register. He breathed once. There were rumors years ago when my family was still in active business with the Romano side. Rumors about Victor's wife, about why she left, about he stopped, started again, about whether you were Victor's biological daughter. The room went very quiet. Tia stood in the middle of it and let the words settle the way you let something heavy settle before you decide whether you can lift it. She thought about her mother, a woman she'd seen exactly 4 times since she was 9 years old, a woman who left with nothing and sent birthday cards and envelopes with no return address. She thought about the way Victor looked at her, sometimes especially in the last 2 years, especially since his business started going wrong. The way the look had changed from the flat ownership of a man who sees his property to something she'd never been able to name. Something that was almost like contempt. Like she reminded him of something he'd rather forget. Say the rest of it, she said. The rumor was Zane said carefully that your mother had an affair, and that the man she had the affair with was my father. Tia turned and walked to the window. She stood with her back to him and breathed. Behind her, Zane didn't move. He didn't fill the silence. She realized somewhere in the outer layer of her mind that he'd learned the same thing she had about silences. She was grateful for it in a way she couldn't have explained. Your father, she said without turning, who is also dead. 3 years ago, before I put this plan together, before I found out that Victor was responsible for Matteo, yes. His voice was even. He died thinking it was natural. I don't know if he knew about Victor's involvement in the warehouse. I don't know what he knew about a lot of things. She turned around. Her face was composed. It cost her something to keep it composed, but she paid the cost. If that rumor is true, if Carver has documentation of it, then what it means to my father is that I was never really his, which means the alliance with DeLuca was never really about expanding his power. It was about offloading something he'd already stopped claiming. Zane didn't contradict her. And it means, she continued, that Carver is sitting on information that is simultaneously a weapon against my father and a reason my father might decide that cleaning up loose ends is preferable to negotiating. She felt the implications land in order one after another, like a sequence she was reading. He's not just threatening you with those records. He's threatening Victor too. He's been running his own insurance policy for 18 months, and now he's calling me because the situation has become unstable and he wants to reposition. He wants a third option, Zane said. He wants whoever survives, she said flatly. He's hedging. Zane crossed his arms. Then he's more dangerous than I calculated. Most people are. She sat back down at the table. Her hands were steady. She made sure of that. We need to get to that storage unit before he moves whatever's in it. If he's calling me directly, he's nervous. And when men like Carver get nervous, they either run or they burn what they're carrying so no one else can use it. My people can be at the facility in 40 minutes. It won't be that simple, she said. If he's kept it for 18 months, it's secured. Your people go in without the right access, and he'll have a remote wipe trigger or a physical contingency in place. He's former federal. He knows how to build a system with a dead man's switch. She tapped the edge of the laptop. I need to think about how to approach this without triggering the contingency. Zane watched her. She could feel him watching her in a different way than he had that morning, than he had in the car, than he had at any point in the last 18 hours. She kept her eyes on the screen. Stop looking at me like that. Like what? Like you're revising something. I am revising something, he said with a directness that caught her off guard. No hedge, no deflection, just the plain statement. My understanding of the situation keeps changing, and you're the reason it keeps changing, and I'm trying to decide how to account for that. She finally looked at him. Account for it by trusting that I'm not going to blow this up. We both want the same thing right now. Do we? We want Carver neutralized and the documentation in our hands before my father can have it destroyed. After that, yes, our interests diverge. But right now, she held his gaze. Right now, we want the same thing. He was quiet for a moment, then, after that, when our interests diverge, what do you want, Tia, not from this, from what comes after? Nobody had asked her that in a long time. Maybe nobody had asked her that ever, or not in a way that expected a real answer, instead of the polished one about the family and duty and the future Victor had mapped out for her. She was briefly and completely disarmed, which she hadn't allowed anyone to do to her in years. And the disarming was almost worse than everything else because she hadn't seen it coming. I want to be the one making the decisions, she said, about my life, about what I build and who I build it with and why. That's it. That's the whole answer. Zane nodded slowly, like that was an answer he recognized, like it was the same answer he'd been working toward for 4 years expressed differently. The afternoon pressed forward and neither of them referred to the conversation again, but it sat in the room with them warm and unresolved, and Tia felt it in the way you feel a change in pressure before weather comes. At 3:15, Rafe appeared in the doorway. His face was doing the controlled thing again, the thing that meant he was carrying news he hadn't processed yet. "We have a problem," he said. Zane looked up. Victor Romang just moved 6 men to the north side. 2 vehicles confirmed Romang's security. They're sitting 3 blocks from the Sable restaurant. Rafe paused. "And they've got a second team at the storage facility address." Tia looked at Zane. He found Carver's location. "Or Carver told him," Zane said tightly, "to buy himself back in. If Victor gets to those records first." "I know. Then everything you've built for 4 years." "I know, Tia." He was already moving, already pulling out his phone. "Rafe, get Demas and Santos. We leave in 10. He turned to her. His eyes were direct and unequivocal. "You stay here. This is going to..." "No," she said. "Tia. I know how my father's why I'm invited to operate. I know their communication protocols, and I know their chain of command, and I know that when Victor sends a team somewhere, he sends a secondary team that doesn't check in on the same frequency, which means your people will walk into whatever he's set up without knowing there's a second layer." She stood up. "You need me there." "It's not safe. Nothing about this is safe." That stopped being the relevant question approximately 24 hours ago. He looked at her. She looked back. She could feel him running the calculation, weighing what she'd said, refusing to dismiss it, just because it was inconvenient for whatever protective instinct was trying to operate in him right now. "You stay in the vehicle," he said. "Until I'm needed," she said. He held her gaze for one more second. "Until you're needed," he conceded. And it came out sounding like something more than a tactical concession, though neither of them said so. In the car moving fast through the city, Tia sat beside Zane in the back and watched the streets and didn't think about her father's men waiting at that storage facility. She thought about Carver instead, about the phone call, about the deliberate precision of what he'd told her, your lineage, the way you understand everything that's happened to you. He'd said it like a man dropping a hook, like a man who'd identified the exact thing she'd spent her whole life not fully knowing, and had used it as bait, and she was angry at herself for letting it pull at her even now, even in the middle of this. But it pulled. Bound. She couldn't pretend it didn't. Demas in the front passenger seat turned halfway. "Romang team is stationary. They haven't gone in yet. They might be waiting for authorization." "Victor won't authorize a breach without confirmation the documentation is actually there," Tia said. Both men in the front seat looked at her. She continued. "He's methodical. He won't move on a location until he has eyes on the asset, which means Carver either hasn't confirmed it or hasn't communicated it yet, which means there's still time." Zane leaned forward. "Can we get eyes on Carver's position?" Demas was already on his radio. The car stopped 2 streets from the facility. Through the window, Tia could see nothing that looked like threat, which meant her father's men were good at what they did, and she respected the competence, even as she needed it to fail. Zane was on the phone low and fast, directing his people to the secondary perimeter. Then Rafe's voice came through the radio, and what he said stopped everything in the car. "Carver just walked into the facility, front entrance. He's alone." A beat. "He's carrying an accelerant." Tia's blood went cold. "He's going to burn it." Zane was out of the car before she finished the sentence. She was half a step behind him. He didn't waste breath telling her to stay. They moved fast across the distance, her heart slamming in her chest in a rhythm that was clean and focused, and not fear. Or not only fear, and when they reached the facility entrance, Zane's hand caught her arm for exactly 1 second, not to stop her, just contact brief and grounding, and then let go, and they went through the door together. Carver was standing in the middle of the storage corridor with a metal canister in one hand and a phone in the other. And when he saw Tia, he went still in a way that said he hadn't expected her. He'd expected Zane's people. He had not expected her specifically, and she filed that too because the things that surprise people told you what they'd been assuming about you, and she was done being assumed about. "Put it down," Zane said. Carver looked between them. He was older than she'd pictured from the voice mid-50s gray, the kind of unremarkable face that was its own camouflage. His eyes were smart and tired and currently running a calculation that she could almost follow on his face. "You brought her," he said to Zane. "Interesting choice." "Put the canister down," Zane said again. Same tone, not louder. Men like Zane, she was learning, didn't need volume. "I called her," Carver said, "because I wanted to offer something. An arrangement. Those records." He tilted his head toward a specific unit door behind him. "Don't have to burn. They don't have to go to Victor either. There's a third option." "What option?" Tia said. Carver looked at her. His expression changed in a way she didn't expect, something that was almost strangely like relief. "You," he said. "You're the option. You take the records. All of them. Everything I have on your father is on the warehouse, on things that go back further than Valente's timeline." He paused. "Including what I know about your mother." The word landed in the corridor like something dropped from a height. Zane went very still beside her. She could feel it without looking at him, the controlled intake, the deliberate hold. He was steadying himself for her. The recognition of that moved through her chest in a way she didn't examine right now, couldn't afford to examine right now. "If I take the records," she said to Carver, "what do you get?" "I get to walk away," he said simply, "from your father, from this city, from 18 months of knowing that the man I work for is looking for a reason to make me a liability. I've been waiting for someone to come along who could actually use what I have." He looked at her with something that might have been respect, or the closest thing to it that a man like Carver was capable of. "I didn't expect it to be you, but here we are." She looked at the canister in his hand. She looked at the door behind him. She felt Zane beside her, waiting, not deciding for her, not reaching past her, waiting. She took a step forward. "Hand me the canister," she said, "and open the door." Carver studied her for one long moment. Then he set the canister on the floor and turned to the unit behind him and punched in a code. And the door rolled up, and what was inside was not a dramatic archive, not rows of filing cabinets. It was a single fireproof box, black and compact, the size of something you could carry with one hand. The kind of thing a careful man built an entire insurance policy into. Tia walked forward and picked it up. It was heavier than it looked. She turned back to Zane. He was watching her with that expression. She still didn't have a word for the one that had been building across 2 days and had no clean name, and she looked at him, and he looked at her, and the weight of the box in her hands was real and specific, and hers in a way that almost nothing in her life had ever been. "We need to move," Zane said quietly. "Your father's team is going to find an empty corridor," she said. She was already moving toward the door. "Let's go." They went. Behind them, Carver disappeared in the other direction, a man exercising the only freedom left available to someone who'd spent too long knowing things about dangerous people. Tia didn't watch him go. She kept her eyes forward at the box in her hands. Zane one step to her left, and the city opening up around them as they moved back into it. Different now, weighted differently, pointing towards something that didn't have a clear shape yet, but was coming fast. In the car with the box on her lap, in the city moving past the windows, she felt Zane look at her. "You okay?" he asked. It was the first time he'd asked her that. Not tactically, not strategically, just the plain question. She thought about it honestly, which was something she hadn't done in a while. She thought about this morning in her father's dining room, and the pen and the contract, and the way he'd turned his back on her before the ink was dry. She thought about Matteo, 22 years old, and her mother's birthday cards with no return address, and a fireproof box sitting on her knees with the shape of her entire life locked inside it. "No," she said, "but I'm going to be." Zane nodded. He didn't offer anything else, no comfort that would have rung false, no reassurance she didn't need. Just the nod and the space and the steady presence of someone who understood that some things you had to carry for a minute before you could set them down. It was, she thought, the most honest thing anyone had offered her in years. She held the box tighter and watched the city and let herself feel the full weight of what was coming. They opened the box at the kitchen table at 4:53 in the afternoon, and what was inside it was worse than either of them had prepared for. Not worse in the sense of being incomplete, worse in the sense of being thorough. Carver had not kept notes the way a careful man keeps notes selectively with gaps where the most dangerous things lived. He had kept notes the way a man keeps notes when he's terrified, which is to say completely leaving nothing out because a partial record could be disputed and a complete record could not. Every meeting, every instruction, every transaction, dates, amounts, names, and in several places, photographs printed on plain paper slightly grainy, the kind of photographs taken from a distance by someone who understood that the most valuable evidence was the kind the subject didn't know existed. Tia went through it methodically. She'd been going through her father's world methodically her entire life, reading between lines, cataloging what wasn't said alongside what was, and she brought that same controlled attention to every page. Zane sat across from her and read his own sections, and the room was quiet except for the sound of pages turning and occasionally one of them saying something low and specific to the other. What built between them in that quiet was not comfort exactly. It was something more functional than comfort, the ease of two people who have stopped performing for each other because the situation has made performance irrelevant. She'd noticed it happening gradually across the last 2 days. The shedding of layers like the Cold War between them was thawing, not because either of them had decided to let it, but because the work they were doing together didn't leave room for it. She was aware of it. She chose not to name it. At 5:41, she turned a page and stopped. Zane, she said. He looked up. She turned the page toward him without a word. He read it. She watched his face, which did something she hadn't seen it do before. Not the flicker from the car, not the controlled recalibration. This was something that went all the way through him, a visible passage of something that moved from his jaw to his eyes to the set of his shoulders, and when it was done, he was very still. In a way that was different from his usual stillness. This was the stillness of someone who has just received something they've been waiting for and discovered that receiving it doesn't feel the way waiting for it felt. The document was a memo. Carver's handwriting dated 4 years and 3 months ago, 1 month before the warehouse. It detailed a meeting between Victor Romano and two men whose names Zane recognized because they were the men who had been with Matteo that night. Victor had not sent them to the warehouse in response to a dispute. He had paid them to set the meeting. He had manufactured the conflict specifically to draw Matteo Valente into a location he controlled. Matteo had not been collateral damage. He had been the target. He knew, Zane said. His voice was very quiet. He knew Matteo was going to be there. He arranged it. Yes, Tia said. This was never about the warehouse. No. Zane set the page down flat on the table. He put both hands on either side of it and looked at it. Tia watched him process and did not look away because she felt instinctively that looking away would be a kind of abandonment, and she was not going to abandon him in this moment. She didn't fully understand why she felt that. She accepted that she felt it. Why Matteo, he said finally, not to her, just to the air. There's more, she said carefully. She turned 3 pages forward and slid the section to him. The second document was older. 7 years old. It was a record of a business agreement, a partnership legitimate on its surface between Victor Romano and the senior Valente. Her father and Zane's father doing business together in the years before the war between their families. The agreement covered 3 warehouses and 2 distribution contracts, and buried in the 3rd paragraph of the 2nd page was a clause about dispute resolution that read plainly, meant that if either partner died, his share reverted to the survivor. She watched Zane read it. She watched him reach the clause. She watched him go back and read it again. My father trusted him, Zane said. Yes. They were partners. Yes, his jaw was tight. She could see the muscle working. Victor didn't want the Valente operation destroyed. He wanted it absorbed. And Matteo was... He stopped, started again. Matteo was the one who was going to run it after my father stepped back. My father announced that 8 months before the warehouse. It was internal family only, but Victor had enough people close to us that he would have known. Matteo was the obstacle, Tia said gently, to everything reverting cleanly. Zane stood up. He walked to the other side of the room. He stood with his back to her and breathed, and she let him. She sat with the documents and looked at the pages without reading them and gave him the time he needed to take what he'd just learned and find somewhere inside himself to put it that didn't destroy the next 5 things he needed to do. After 2 minutes, he turned around. His face was composed. Not shut down, she'd learned the difference between those two things on him. Composed meant he'd processed enough to function. Shut down was when he stopped letting anything through at all. This was composure. He was still in there. "We have enough," he said. "We have more than enough," she said. "Then it's time to contact my people. The ones who can actually receive this, the investigators outside my father's network, the ones Victor hasn't bought." He came back to the table. He didn't sit. He stood with his hands on the back of the chair and looked at her directly. "When this goes forward, Tia, your father, is going to be finished in this city. His protection structure collapses when these documents hit the right desks. Everything he's built." "I know," she said. "And I know," she said again, steadier. "I've known since the storage unit. I made my choice before I picked up that box. Don't walk it back for me." He held her gaze. "I'm not walking it back. I'm making sure you understand the size of it." "Zane." She said his name the way she'd said it once before, the way that meant stop managing this and talk to me. "I understand the size of it. My father used me as a bargaining chip my entire life. He put my hand against a table and held it there until I signed away my future. And somewhere in that box there are documents that tell me he may not even be my biological father, which means everything he took from me was taken on a lie." She looked at the box, looked back at him. "The size of it doesn't frighten me. It frees me." Something in Zane's expression shifted completely. Open in a way she hadn't seen him open before, a door swinging outward. He pulled out the chair and sat down across from her and said nothing for a moment. And then he said, "My brother would have liked you." It came out unguarded. She could tell by the way he looked slightly away after he said it, like he hadn't planned it and wasn't sure what to do with having said it. She was careful with it. She didn't make too much of it. Didn't fold it over and examine it in a way that would make him close again. "Tell me something about him," she said simply. Zane was quiet for a moment. He laughed at everything. Couldn't help it. You'd be in the middle of a serious conversation and he'd find something funny about it, and he'd be gone completely useless. It was infuriating. The corner of his mouth moved. He made everyone around him feel like whatever they were doing was worth doing. That thing some people have where the room just shifts when they walk in. He stopped. "I haven't talked about him in 4 years. I didn't." He stopped again. "You didn't let yourself," she said. "No. Because you were afraid if you let yourself feel it, you'd lose the plan." He looked at her. "Yes. And now you have the plan," she said, "and the documentation. And it's almost over." "Almost," he said. She looked at him. "What does over feel like for you after this?" "I genuinely don't know," he said. "I haven't thought past this moment in 4 years." She understood that too in her own way. She'd spent 4 years not thinking past the next refusal, the next negotiation her father tried to make her complicit, and the next door she had to close quietly instead of slamming. She hadn't built a picture of after because after had felt like something that belonged to a different person's life. "Then we'll figure it out," she said. And then, because it was true and she was done not saying true things on our own terms, he looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once and picked up his phone and began to make the calls. It was at 6:22 that everything shifted. Rafe walked in from the other room and his face was doing the controlled thing in a way she'd learned meant the news was bad and he was keeping it from hitting the air too fast. "Victor's moving," he said. "Not his security team. Him, personally. He's in a vehicle heading toward the north side." Zane looked up. "He's not going to Sable," Rafe said. "The tracker puts him on the route to this street." The room went cold. "He found the house," Zane said. "How?" Tia said immediately. "You've owned this building for 14 months. If he'd known..." "He didn't know," Zane said, and she saw the rapid movement behind his eyes. "Someone told him. Tonight. Someone who knew we came back here after the storage unit." She ran it back. The route from the facility, the number of people who knew where this house was. And then she felt it land the piece she should have caught earlier, the thing that had been slightly off since the afternoon. "Carver," she said. "Carver called me before we went to the facility. He said meet me alone. He knew we'd come back here after." "He traded it," Zane said flatly. "He told us he wanted to walk away. He gave us the box. And then he traded the house address to Victor as the second insurance policy, in case we weren't the side that survived." He hedged, she said, it exactly like I said he would. Yes. Zane was already standing, already moving. Rafe, get the others. He looked at his watch, 12 minutes before Victor's vehicle arrives based on current position. We can move the documents, Rafe started. We're not running, Tia said. Both men looked at her. She was standing with the box in her hands and her voice was level, and she was absolutely certain of what she was about to say. If we run, he chases. If he chases, this goes on for weeks and nothing gets resolved, and the documents go into some safe somewhere, and my father goes back to controlling the situation through attrition and delay, which is what he's best at. She set the box on the table. I want to end this tonight. Tia, Zane said. Let him come, she said. Let him come here, and let me talk to him. That is not. I have the box, she said. I have everything Carver built. I have documentation of what he did to Matteo, and I have proof that the alliance he tried to force me into was built on a lie, and I have enough information in this one box to take his entire protection structure apart in this city. She looked at Zane directly. And I have you, and I have Rafe, and I have your people outside. He doesn't come here to fight. He's not that reckless. He comes here to negotiate, so let him. She paused. And let me be the one across the table from him. Zane looked at her. The look went on long enough that she could feel him weighing it fully. Not dismissing it, actually weighing it, turning it over to find the breaks in it, and not finding enough breaks to reject it. If it goes wrong, he said. It won't, she said. I know how to talk to him. I've been talking to him my whole life. A beat. I've just never talked to him from a position of power before. Rafe in the corner made the small sound again. The one that wasn't quite a laugh. Zane held her gaze for one more second. I'm in the room, he said. Behind you, not beside you, because I don't want him performing for me when he should be listening to you. But I'm in the room. Agreed, she said. They had 7 minutes. She used them to read 2 more sections of the documentation, refreshing specific details, the dates and names she'd need immediate access to when her father tried to deflect. She wasn't afraid. She noticed that the way you notice your own body temperature, a neutral observation. She thought she'd be afraid. What she was instead was present in a way she almost never was. Her attention sitting right at the surface of the moment without the usual layer of performance between her and the world. Victor Romang walked into the house at 6:34. He came with 2 men, which meant he'd come ready to project authority, but not ready to fight 2 men was statement, not strategy. And she read it as exactly that. He walked through the entry and into the main room and stopped when he saw her. He hadn't expected her to be standing. He'd expected, she realized, to find her somewhere in the architecture of someone else's situation, seated, managed, peripheral. He had not expected her to be standing at the head of a table with her hands flat on its surface and the fireproof box between her arms, like she owned the room and everything in it. Behind her, a step back, Zane stood without saying anything. Her father's eyes moved to Zane, and something crossed his face, the cold, particular contempt of a man who believes that everything that has happened to him has been done to him rather than earned. Then his eyes came back to Tia, and the contempt changed into something more complicated. Something she'd seen once before the night she'd refused the first alliance 2 years ago. It was the look of a man who has underestimated something and doesn't want to admit it. Tia, he said. Papa, she said, just as calm, just as measured. She'd practiced his voice her whole life. She knew how to match it. Whatever he's told you. I found the box, she said. Carver's box, I have it. She touched it lightly. I have everything. Victor's eyes went to the box. Something moved through him that he controlled instantly, but she'd been watching for it, and she caught it. Carver is a careful man, she said, with very thorough records, including a memo dated 4 years and 3 months ago, 1 month before the warehouse detailing a meeting you arranged specifically to bring Matteo Valente into a location you controlled. She kept her voice even. You didn't send men to a dispute, Papa. You manufactured the dispute. Because Matteo was the obstacle between you and absorbing the Valente operation completely. Under a partnership agreement, you and the senior Valente signed 7 years ago. The 2 men behind Victor didn't move. Victor himself didn't move. But the air in the room changed. That is, her father said very quietly, a serious accusation. And it's a documented fact, she said. Carver documented everything because he was afraid of exactly this moment, the moment you decided he knew too much. She looked at her father steadily. The same reason you came here tonight. Not for me, for the box. Something in Victor's composure cracked. Not collapsed, he was too controlled for collapse, but cracked the way old stone cracks when the temperature drops fast. He took a step forward. You don't understand what you're holding. I understand exactly what I'm holding, she said. I've had 2 days to understand it, and I had a very good teacher. She didn't gesture toward Zane. She didn't need to. This box ends your protection structure in this city. The investigators who've been bought, the officials who've been managed when this documentation hits the right desks, none of that holds. You know that. That's why you came. Tia, his voice was different now, lower. The performance layer was gone. She'd never heard it entirely gone before. It was almost worse without it. The naked thing underneath was not warmth, was not the father she'd spent years hoping existed underneath the power. It was just fear, old rigid, ugly fear dressed up as authority for so long it had forgotten it was fear. Don't do this. You held my hand against a table, she said. You pressed down until I stopped fighting. You sold me to a man I didn't choose to protect, an empire I never wanted a part of, and you did it without looking at my face. Her voice didn't shake. She was proud of that. She was genuinely, quietly proud. You don't get to stand there and ask me not to do this. The silence that followed was absolute. Victor looked at his daughter across the table, and she looked back at him, and neither of them looked away. Then Victor looked at Zane for the first time since he'd entered. The look was long and specific and contained everything 2 families and 4 years of war held. You used her, he said. She chose this, Zane said from behind her. Simple. No elaboration. She's my daughter. Then you should have treated her like one. Victor's jaw tightened. She felt the room stretch, felt the men behind her father shift their weight, felt the whole thing balance on a point so fine it could have gone either direction. She moved before it could tip the wrong way. Here is what happens, she said. Tomorrow morning, a copy of this documentation goes to 3 separate investigators outside your network. That process has already been initiated. She looked at her father calmly. This was the lie, the one she and Zane had agreed on in the 7 minutes before Victor arrived, because the initiation hadn't happened yet, but her father didn't know that. And the threat of it was the same as the fact of it. If anything happens to me or to anyone in this house tonight, those copies release automatically. If nothing happens, you have 48 hours to contact your attorneys and begin the process of cooperating. Cooperating, Victor repeated. Cooperating, she said again. The alternative is that everything releases without your input, and you have no ability to shape any part of what comes next. Cooperation at least gives you some degree of control over the narrative. She paused, which is, as we both know, the thing you've always valued most. Her father looked at her, really looked at her in a way he hadn't in years, in a way that felt less like a man seeing a transaction and more like a man seeing something he'd lost track of somewhere and was only now recognizing. She didn't let it soften her. She was done being softened by almost moments with him. Where did you learn to do this, he said, and it came out quiet, almost involuntary. From you, she said simply. I watched you my whole life. I just waited until I had something real to work with. Victor Romano stood in that room for 3 more seconds. Then he turned and walked out, his 2 men following, and the door of the house closed behind him, and the silence that came after was enormous and clean and hers. She let out a breath, a long one. Then she sat down in the nearest chair because her legs had decided they were done performing. Zane was beside her in 2 steps. He crouched down to her level and looked at her face with an expression that had given up trying to be tactical. You okay? He asked exactly as he had in the car. And like the car, she appreciated that he asked it plainly. I will be, she said. In a minute. Take the minute, he said. Ray from the doorway said, I'll start the process. Actually initiate it this time. Please, Zane said without looking away from Tia. She looked at Zane, he looked at her. In the space between them was everything that had happened in 48 hours, the nightclub and the car and the war room and the storage unit. In this room, the whole compressed, violent, clarifying experience of 2 days that had rearranged everything. She felt it all sitting there present and unresolved, and she didn't try to name it or contain it. We need to talk, she said, about what comes next. I know, he said, not tonight. No, he agreed, not tonight. She nodded. She looked at her hands. The box was still on the table, solid and real, and full of the heaviest truth she'd ever had to hold. She thought about what Carver had said, your lineage, the way you understand everything that happened to you, and she thought about the section of the documentation she hadn't opened yet, the one that would tell her whether the man who just walked out of this room was her father in any real sense of the word. She would open it, but not tonight. Tonight she needed to be exactly where she was, in this chair, in this room with the man who had taken her for revenge and ended up with something neither of them had planned for. That was, she thought, the way the important things usually happened. Not according to the plan, just right in the middle of it when you were looking somewhere else. She opened the last section of the box at 11 o'clock that night alone. She'd asked Zane for an hour. He'd given it without argument, without the look that men sometimes gave when they were granting permission they thought you should be grateful for. He just nodded and closed the door behind him, and she'd sat with the box and the quiet and the knowledge that what she was about to read would either confirm something she'd been half carrying her whole life or dissolve it, and either way, she would not be the same person on the other side of it. The document was not what she'd expected. She'd expected a letter maybe, or a clinical record. What she found was a series of photographs her mother, younger than Tia was now, standing beside a man she'd seen in exactly one photograph before the photograph that Zane kept on the small shelf in the war room beside the window, the one he'd turned slightly away from the wall like he wasn't ready to take it down, but wasn't ready to keep looking at it either. Alessandro Valente, Zane's father. Her mother's face in the photographs was not the face of a woman conducting an affair. It was the face of a woman who had found something she hadn't known she was looking for, something that lived in the way she stood close to the man beside her, the way her whole body seemed to lean toward him without touching. Tia had seen her mother's face express very few things in her lifetime. She had not seen it express this. Below the photographs was a single handwritten letter. Her mother's handwriting, she recognized it from the birthday cards, the careful, slightly formal script of a woman who'd been taught that penmanship was the last thing you could control when everything else was gone. The letter was addressed to no one. It began, I am writing this because someone should know the truth, even if that someone is only paper. Tia read it straight through without stopping. When she finished, she set it face down on the table and sat with her hands in her lap for a long time. The facts were these: her mother had known Alessandro Valente before she married Victor Romano. She had loved him in the way that first loves work, entirely unwisely with no reserve. Victor had intervened, not cruelly, not with violence, but with the particular precision of a man who understood that love, like any asset, could be acquired if you moved fast enough and removed the competition cleanly enough. Alessandro had been made to understand that Elena was not available to him. He had believed it. He had married someone else. Elena had married Victor 6 months later, and 9 months after the wedding, Tia had been born. The letter didn't say it directly. Her mother hadn't been able to write it directly, but it lived in every word around the absence, in the way the letter circled and circled, without landing in the single line near the end that read, she has his eyes. She has always had his eyes. Victor knows. Victor has always known. Tia sat with that for a long moment. Then she got up and walked out of the room and found Zane in the kitchen, sitting with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, staring at nothing in the way of a man whose thoughts are somewhere very far from his body. He looked up when she came in. He read her face. Tell me, he said quietly. She sat across from him and told him. All of it. The photographs, the letter, the circling around the absence, the single line about the eyes. She told him the way she'd learned to tell true things plainly without decoration, because decoration was what you used when you weren't sure of the thing you were saying, and she was completely sure. When she finished, the kitchen was very quiet. Zane looked at her for a long moment. She watched him process it, watched the thing it meant move through him, that they were connected, had always been connected in a way that had nothing to do with kidnappings or revenge or documents in a fireproof box. That the war between their families had been at its root, one man's inability to accept that something he'd acquired had never truly belonged to him. Tia, he said, and her name in his voice had a different weight than it had carried even this morning. I know, she said. He stopped. I don't know what the right thing to say is. There isn't one, she said. I've been sitting in there for an hour looking for it, and it doesn't exist. There's just the fact. She looked at him steadily. Your father and my mother. Which makes what Victor did to Matteo. Personal in a way that goes deeper than business, Zane said. His jaw tightened. He didn't just want the operation. He wanted to take something from my father specifically. Something connected to Elena. Something that would, he stopped. He was punishing my father for something that happened 30 years ago. He held grudges, Tia said. It's the one consistent thing about him. He never let anything go. And Matteo paid for it. Yes. The anger that moved through Zane's face then was different from anything she'd seen on him across the last 48 hours. All the other anger had been shaped, directed, running through the channel of 4 years of careful planning. This was raw and without direction, the anger of someone who has just discovered that the wound was larger than the map they'd been using to find it. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. He looked at her hand, he looked at her face. Something in him that had been held at a controlled distance for the entire time she'd known him moved toward her now. Not dramatically, not with announcement, but the way a tide moves gradually then all at once. We share a father, he said, quietly, like he was finding the shape of it. We share a father, she confirmed, which means Matteo was your brother, he said, in every way that mattered, yes. She hadn't let herself get there yet. She felt it now, the full weight of it, a brother she'd never known existed. A brother who'd been 22 and laughed at everything and made the room shift when he walked into it, and he was gone before she ever had the chance to know him, gone because of the man who'd held her hand against a table and called it family. She breathed through it. She kept her hand on Zane's. Then this was never just your fight, she said. It was mine too. I just didn't know it. Rafe appeared in the doorway at 11:47. He looked at their hands on the table and looked at their faces and did not make a comment, which was one of the things she'd come to appreciate most about him. The documentation has been received, he said. All 3 contacts confirmed. The process is moving. A pause. And Victor Romang's attorneys contacted us 40 minutes ago. He's agreed to cooperate. Neither Tia nor Zane said anything for a moment. It's done, she said. The beginning of it, Rafe said. The legal process takes time. But the foundation, yes, it's done. Zane exhaled. A single long controlled exhale, 4 years of held breath, finding its way out. She felt it more than heard it, felt it in the hand she was still holding. The slight release of something that had been coiled so long, it had forgotten how to be otherwise. She held on until he came back to the surface of the room, and then he looked at her. And what was on his face now was something she had no category for in her experience of him, unguarded in a way that had nothing tactical in it. Just open, just present. Matteo would have found this entire situation, he said slowly, extremely funny. She raised an eyebrow. A kidnapping that turned into a family reunion. And a business partnership, he said. And he stopped himself. But she'd seen what was behind the stop. She let it sit. And whatever the other thing is, she said carefully, that we're not naming yet. Yes, he said. That. She nodded once. That was enough for now. She was not a woman who needed things named before she could trust them. She was a woman who watched what people did and built her understanding from that. And what Zane had done across 2 days was more substantial than most people managed across years. She trusted that. She didn't need to put a word to it tonight. At 2 a.m, Rafe brought them both food they actually ate, and they sat at the kitchen table and talked, not about Victor, not about the documentation or the legal process or what came next strategically. They talk the way people talk when the emergency has passed and the ordinary world is reasserting itself, and you realize you've been through something with a person and now you actually want to know who they are when they're not navigating a crisis. He told her about Matteo's laugh, the specific texture of it, how it was the kind of laugh that embarrassed everyone nearby because you couldn't hear it and not join in whether you wanted to or not. She told him about the 2 years she'd spent studying law in secret, taking online courses her father didn't know about, building a credential. She'd never been sure she'd have the freedom to use. He told her about the warehouse, standing outside it for the first time after in the cold, not being able to go in. She told him about the birthday cards with no return address, and how every year she'd stared at the postmark, trying to narrow down where her mother might be. I can find her, Zane said. She looked at him. My people are good at finding things, he said. People, places, documents in fireproof boxes. A very small smile. If you want her found, she thought about it honestly. I don't know yet, she said. I might need some time first. Take the time, he said. Exactly what she needed to hear. No pressure, no urgency, no opinion about what she should want. She looked at him across the table in the low kitchen light and thought about 48 hours ago about the back of a nightclub and a man holding a small black card and saying, "I needed a reason to talk to you." She thought about how close she'd been to screaming, to going back inside, to letting her father's men take her home and dress her in white and hand her to Marco DeLuca like she was a signed check. She thought about the version of her life that had been scheduled, that had been arranged and laid out like the contract on that table, every page of it determined by a man who had never once asked her what she wanted. She looked at the man across the table from her now, the man who had taken her for revenge and instead had handed her the tools to take apart the cage she'd been living in, who had listened when she talked and moved when she moved and stood behind her, not beside her, not in front, behind, supporting without overriding while she looked her father in the eye and said enough. "I want to go back to school," she said. "Finish the law degree properly. Not online, not in secret, properly." "Okay," he said. "And I want an office," she said. "Somewhere I can work on cases that matter. Not corporate, not the kind of law my father's world uses. The other kind. The kind that goes after people like your father," he said. "Among others," she said. "I can help with the funding," he said. "For the office he considered the word as a partner." She looked at him. The word between them was old enough now to have weight. It had been said in crisis and held under pressure and had not broken. "Partners," she said. "Partners," he confirmed. She held his gaze. "And the other thing," she said, "the one we're not naming yet." "Still not naming it yet," he said. "But I'm not pretending it's not there." "Good," she said. "Neither am I." The documentation moved through the system, the way fire moves through dry things, fast and comprehensive and without mercy. Victor Romang's attorneys spent 3 days trying to construct a defense and abandoned it on the fourth morning when the first of the outside investigators confirmed the memo about the warehouse. The protection structure her father had spent 20 years building came apart with a quiet efficiency that almost no one outside the relevant circles ever fully understood, which was exactly how these things worked when they were done right. Marco DeLuca, whose alliance had been the reason for the contract and the pen and the bruise on Tia's wrist, withdrew without being asked. He was above all things a practical man and a man who understood that an alliance with a collapsing empire was not a strategic asset. The wedding that had been scheduled for a Saturday morning came and went. Tia spent it in Zane's kitchen drinking coffee and reading a brief from one of the investigators. And at some point in the late morning, she looked up and realized she hadn't thought about it once until just now. And that felt like something worth noting. Not with celebration, just with quiet acknowledgement. The call from her mother came on the 11th day. She didn't know how Elena had found the number. She suspected Zane had something to do with it, though he denied it with the particular expression of a man who is not technically lying, but is definitely not telling the whole truth. She was going to address that later. She answered the call on the second ring. "Tia." Her mother's voice was older than she'd imagined it, steadier, the voice of a woman who had spent years in a quiet place building something inside herself that couldn't be taken. "Mama," she said, and then, because she had decided to stop waiting for the right moment and just say the true things, I read the letter. The silence on the other end was long. She let it be long. "I should have told you," her mother said finally. "Yes," Tia said, not unkindly, just truthfully. "Are you—" Elena stopped. "How are you?" "I'm better than I was," Tia said. "I'm working on something real." She looked across the room where Zane was pretending to read something he was obviously not reading. "I'm surrounded by people who tell me the truth, which is new." She paused. "I'd like to see you when you're ready." "I've been ready," her mother said, "for a long time. I just didn't know if you would be." "I am now," Tia said. After she hung up, she sat for a moment with the phone in her hand. Then she looked at Zane and he looked at her and she said, "You found her." "I found a phone number," he said carefully. "I made no contact. I left it in a place where the right information might move if someone wanted it to." That is an incredibly elaborate way of saying yes. "I wanted her to reach out on her own terms," he said. "Not because I pressured her. It needed to come from her." She looked at him. The thing she still hadn't named was very loud in the room right now. "That was—" she started. "Don't," he said. "You'll make it weird." She laughed. It surprised her, the full, genuine laugh that came up without permission, the kind she hadn't heard from herself in so long. She'd half forgotten the sound. He looked at her when she laughed, and his face did the thing it had been doing more frequently across these 11 days. The thing that was not quite a smile, but lived in the same neighborhood. The thing that made him look like a man who was learning slowly and with some resistance. That the life on the other side of 4 years of grief was still worth showing up for. She thought about Matteo, who had laughed at everything. She thought about how Zane had said it with that involuntary grief in his voice. He made everyone feel like whatever they were doing was worth doing. She thought it was possible in the strange and non-linear way that things were possible, that Matteo was still doing that, just from a different position. 3 weeks after Victor Romang's attorneys filed for cooperation, Tia signed the lease on an office on the 4th floor of a building 6 blocks from the courthouse. It was not a large office. It was not impressive in any of the ways her father's world had used the word impressive. It had 2 desks, a window that looked out over a street rather than a skyline, and a door with a frosted glass panel that she'd ordered with her name on it in plain black letters. Zane came with her when she picked up the key. He stood in the empty office and looked around it and said nothing for a moment, and she knew he was feeling the same thing she was feeling, the specific weight of a thing that had been built in the wreckage of something else, the particular quality of something that was entirely yours because you'd built it entirely on your own terms. "It's good," he said. "It's mine," she said. "That's what makes it good." She turned to him. 11 days of proximity and truth-telling and shared meals, and gradually, incrementally, the dissolution of every wall either of them had thought they still needed. 11 days of the unnamed thing growing louder in every room they occupied together. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and she decided, because she had decided to stop waiting, that she was done waiting for this too. "Zane," she said. "Still not naming it," he said. "I'm naming it," she said. He looked at her. Something shifted in his face, the last controlled piece of him releasing, the final managed distance closing. "Okay," he said quietly. "It's this," she said. "What's between us? It's real, and it was real before I decided it was convenient to admit, and I'm not interested in pretending otherwise, because I've spent enough of my life pretending things were other than what they were." She held his gaze. "Your turn." He was quiet for 3 seconds. Then, "I came to that nightclub to take something from Victor Romang." He took 1 step toward her. "What I actually found was the one person in this world who fights the way I fight and thinks the way I think and tells me the truth even when the truth is inconvenient." Another step. "I stopped using you as leverage somewhere around the 2nd hour of the first morning. I just needed longer to say it." She looked at him. He looked at her. The office was empty, and the street outside was ordinary, and the light was flat and real. And nothing about this moment was arranged or performed or orchestrated by anyone other than the 2 of them. And that was exactly right. "Partners," she said. He reached out and took her hand, not like the night in the corridor when he'd held her arm for a single grounding second, not like the kitchen table when she'd put her hand over his to hold him through something hard. This was different. This was chosen clearly without urgency or strategy. Just his hand and hers and the name they'd given to what they were that was true in every direction it pointed. "Partners," he said. They had both started with nothing they'd planned for. They had both come through the other side of it, carrying more than they'd expected, grief and truth and documentation and the strange clarifying knowledge of who you actually were when someone stripped away everything you'd been told to be. Tia Romang had walked into a nightclub the night before a wedding she didn't want, trying to drink herself through the last hours of a life that wasn't hers. She had walked out of it into something that had no roadmap and no safety net and no one's approval but her own. She was standing in an office with her name on the door beside a man who had never once asked her to be smaller than she was, holding a key that belonged to her and no one else. She had not been rescued. She had not been managed or handled or traded or used as anyone's leverage in any game she hadn't chosen to play. She had simply finally, for the first time in her life, decided what she wanted. And then she had gone and taken it. That was the whole story. That was all of it. And it was completely and without question hers.